Saudi Arabia may be one of the most important strategic actors in the entire crisis precisely because it cannot dominate openly. Its weakness is what makes its strategy darker. A truly dominant power can simply impose its will. A constrained power has to think differently. It has to think in time, in positioning, in attrition, in patience. It has to ask not, how do I win this war right now? But how do I come out of this war stronger than the people who are currently bigger than me? That is a much colder question, and it leads to a much darker kind of strategy. This is the theory I want to explain today. Why Saudi Arabia may be playing a longer game than most people realize. Why it may fear Iran, distrust Israel, depend on America, and still quietly benefit from all three becoming weaker. And why some of the most important states in history have not risen through direct conquest, but through careful survival while stronger rivals wore themselves out. Now let us begin with the obvious part. Saudi Arabia sees Iran as a threat, not a temporary threat, a structural threat. That distinction matters. This is not just a disagreement over one policy, one border, one militia, or one diplomatic incident. Iran represents a deeper challenge. A challenge in religion, a challenge in legitimacy, a challenge in regional hierarchy. Saudi Arabia is a monarchy that ties power to one kind of religious authority. Iran is a revolutionary theocratic republic that ties power to another. Saudi Arabia is deeply woven into an American-backed regional order. Iran defines itself through resistance to that order. Saudi Arabia presents itself as a guardian of sacred space and Arab power. Iran presents itself as the champion of a rival axis of defiance. This is not a normal rivalry. It is a rivalry of systems, a rivalry of visions, a rivalry in which each side does not merely dislike the other. Each side represents a future the other cannot fully accept. That is why Saudi Arabia cannot be comfortable with a strong Iran. A strong Iran would not merely be another powerful neighbor. It would be a rival center of gravity, a state capable of pulling the region toward a different strategic logic. And for Saudi Arabia, that is intolerable. So yes, Riyadh wants Iran weakened. That is obvious. But the real story begins after that. Because now we have to ask a more uncomfortable question. Does Saudi Arabia want America to solve the Iran problem so completely that Washington emerges even more powerful than before? Not necessarily. And does Saudi Arabia want Israel to become so strong that it dominates the region after Iran is broken? Also not necessarily. This is the point where ordinary analysis collapses. People assume that if two states oppose the same enemy, they must want the same future. That is childish geopolitics. Real states do not think like that. They ask a harder question: who benefits after the enemy is weakened? And that is where Saudi Arabia becomes much more interesting. Saudi Arabia may want Iran weaker, but it does not automatically want the other dominant players to become stronger in the process. That is the heart of the dark strategy. Now let us think carefully about Saudi Arabia's position. It is rich, but not invulnerable. Influential, but not sovereign in the deepest strategic sense. Armed, but not dominant enough to impose order across the whole region. It has money, it has symbolism, it has religious significance, it has oil, but it also has a problem. Its future is insecure. This is what many people miss. Saudi Arabia is powerful in the present, but anxious about the future. Its economic model remains deeply tied to hydrocarbons. Its regional status rests heavily on resource wealth and external security architecture. Its transformation projects are ambitious, but ambition is not the same as strategic certainty. And states that are uncertain about the future often become more aggressive in the present because they know time may not favor them. That is the psychological key. A state that believes the future may erode its power starts searching for a new basis of power before that erosion becomes unavoidable. That is where Saudi Arabia's long game becomes much darker, because now the goal is not simply preserving today's order, The goal is finding a way to emerge more central in tomorrow's order, and tomorrow's order may only open up if today's stronger powers are weakened first. That is the brutal calculation. Now let us say it plainly. Saudi Arabia may not be strong enough to directly dominate Iran, America, and Israel, but it may not need to be, because there is another path to influence. Wait for stronger players to damage each other. This is one of the oldest and coldest strategic logics in history. When you cannot dominate immediately, you survive, hedge, and wait for overstretch. You let bigger actors burn resources, legitimacy, and energy in conflict. Then, when the hierarchy loosens, you step forward. That is not cinematic, it is not heroic, it is not loud, but it is often effective, and it is very often how second-tier powers rise. Now think about how neatly this logic fits Saudi Arabia's situation. If Iran is weakened, Saudi Arabia benefits. If the United States becomes overcommitted, exhausted, and politically burdened, Saudi Arabia gains relative room. If Israel becomes constrained, bloodied, or checked, Saudi Arabia gains relative room. That is the pattern. The key phrase here is not total victory. It is relative improvement. Saudi Arabia does not need to become the undisputed master of the Middle East overnight. It only needs the stronger actors around it to emerge from the crisis less dominant than before. Then its own position improves by comparison. That is why chaos can be useful, not because chaos is pleasant, but because chaos interrupts hierarchy. And for a state trapped in a hierarchy it cannot permanently control, interruption can look like opportunity. Now let us go deeper into why Saudi Arabia cannot play this game openly. Because it is too weak to do so directly. This is very important. If Saudi Arabia openly tried to impose itself across the region against all major rivals at once, it would fail. Its power is real, but limited. Its wealth is huge, but not enough to substitute for total strategic independence. Its military and political reach are significant, but not sufficient to openly overpower every other major actor. That is why indirect strategy becomes necessary. And indirect strategy always looks darker than direct strategy, because indirect strategy works through timing, positioning, exploitation, and the selective use of disorder. It does not say, I will conquer. It says, I will remain standing while larger actors weaken themselves. That is not a slogan states say in public, but it is exactly the kind of thing they think in private. Now let us think about Israel. This is one of the biggest points of confusion for most audiences. People hear that Saudi Arabia and Israel may share interests against Iran, and they assume that means they are strategically aligned all the way down. No, that is too simple. Shared tactical interest is not the same as shared strategic horizon. Saudi Arabia may benefit from Israel pressuring Iran, but it does not necessarily want a future in which Israel emerges as the unquestioned dominant power of the Middle East. That would not liberate Saudi Arabia. It would simply replace one structural constraint with another. So Saudi Arabia may see value in a prolonged regional contest that weakens Iran and also ensures that no rival hegemon emerges too comfortably from the wreckage. Again, this is why the strategy is dark. It is not about clean alliances. It is about using conflict to prevent anyone else from closing the game. Now let us bring America into the same frame. Saudi Arabia depends heavily on American security architecture. That is true. But dependence is not the same as wanting the patron to remain unconstrained forever. A patron that is too dominant leaves little room for independent maneuver. A patron that is too exhausted becomes less reliable. So Saudi Arabia's ideal is not total American collapse, obviously. That would be dangerous. Its ideal is something more subtle. An America strong enough to remain useful, but burdened enough not to fully dominate the region on its own terms. That is a much more realistic, long-game preference for a state in Saudi Arabia's position. Do you see how dark this becomes? Saudi Arabia may want everyone else weakened, but not necessarily destroyed. Iran weakened, not triumphant. Israel constrained, not supreme. America burdened, not absent. That is sophisticated balancing. Not moral consistency, not ideological purity, balancing. And balancing is often the secret language of states that cannot afford to be fully honest in public. Now think about how this kind of strategy feels from the inside. Imagine you are Saudi Arabia. You know your present wealth is vast, but you are not certain it can preserve your future model indefinitely. You know Iran threatens you ideologically and strategically. You know Israel is powerful and unpredictable. You know America is both protector and limiter. You know your direct freedom of action is narrower than outsiders think. So what is your move? You cannot smash all your rivals directly. You cannot retreat into passivity. You cannot trust that history will preserve your status automatically. So you do the only thing a patient, anxious, ambitious state can do. You watch for the moment when stronger players begin weakening each other. Then you survive that moment better than they do. That is the strategy. Not elegant, not noble, but logical. Now let us talk about why this is underappreciated in public discourse. Because public discourse loves active villains. It loves the image of the state that attacks first, declares loudly, and visibly moves the pieces. It understands open aggression. It does not easily understand patient opportunism. But patient opportunism is often more dangerous in the long run because it does not exhaust itself early. It waits for the system to loosen. It lets time do part of the work, and time is one of the greatest weapons in geopolitics. Saudi Arabia may understand that very well. The region's strongest actors are taking on the heaviest burdens. That means the region's patient actors may inherit more freedom afterward. That is the dark possibility. Now let us consider the role of oil one more time, because this is crucial. Saudi Arabia's current influence rests heavily on a resource model that looks powerful now, but uncertain later. That creates a structural anxiety. If the future value of oil declines relative to the present, then Saudi Arabia's current position contains a hidden clock. And a state living under a hidden clock becomes more strategic, not less, because it realizes it may need to transform its influence before the old foundation weakens. How does it do that? By becoming central not just through oil, but through regional position, bargaining power, and strategic indispensability. That becomes easier in a fragmented order than in a tightly controlled one. Again, this is why chaos can look useful. Not because chaos is stable, but because fragmentation creates openings that rigid hierarchy does not. Now, of course, this strategy is also risky. A state that hopes to benefit from chaos can be burned by chaos too. This is important. The dark long game is not guaranteed success. It is a gamble. A state may hope stronger actors wound each other and instead watch the region become too unstable for anyone to control. That is the danger of all opportunistic strategy. You try to surf the storm, and the storm may swallow you instead. So I am not saying Saudi Arabia has found a perfect strategy. I am saying it may be playing the best dark strategy available from its position, and that strategy is not direct domination. It is strategic patience through mutual weakening. Now let us pull everything together. Saudi Arabia fears Iran because Iran is a religious, political, and strategic rival. Saudi Arabia's future is insecure because its oil-based power model is strong in the present but uncertain over the long term. That means Riyadh needs a new basis of regional advantage. The dark opportunity is this. If stronger players damage each other, Saudi Arabia gains relative room to rise. It cannot force that outcome directly because it is too weak relative to the biggest actors. So it must benefit indirectly by waiting, by hedging, by surviving, by positioning itself to step forward when the old hierarchy loosens. That is the long game. And the final lesson is simple. Some states do not rise by striking first. They rise by letting history exhaust those who are stronger than they are. They rise by understanding that survival, timing, and patience can sometimes matter more than open power. That is why Saudi Arabia may be playing one of the darkest games in the region. Not the game of immediate conquest, the game of controlled waiting. And in geopolitics, the patient actor standing behind the battlefield is often far more important than the loud actor standing in front of it.